Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Gilberto Saenz, and I have Mr. Greg Thomas with us. He's the Director of PA Relations at NCCPA.
Sure, absolutely. And you know that tagline of pulling back the curtain may sound a little hokey, but I added that this year. Let me just sort of say by way of background, I've been doing these updates from NCCPA for PA audiences frequently at state chapter meetings or at PA specialty organization meetings like this one for some time. And you know, just an update from NCCPA by itself sometimes gets a little bit boring. Yeah. And so the focus this year, well, there's a variety of areas of focus that we'll get into, but the pulling back the curtain part comes from, I always do a little bit of shout out to my not so new boss at this point, but as most PAs know, 6 years ago now, NCCPA appointed a PA for the first time, a PA as the CEO of the organization. And Dawn Morton-Reyes serves in that role, a PA for a long time, clearly brings a lot of passion for the profession to that role. But she has two particular areas of focus. One is to increase the transparency of how NCCPA works and how we make decisions about policies and processes, hence the pulling back the curtain part. And the second part that we'll get into in a little bit more is getting many more PAs involved in the organization. So that's kind of the rationale for this update from NCCPA, and then we'll talk about some more specifics too that I think is good news for PAs.
That's great. I really, as a PA myself, I really appreciate the transparency. I think a lot of my colleagues would share the same sentiment.
Yeah, and I think to be very candid, NCCPA, although the organization's been around for almost 50 years now, well not quite, but almost, has not always been so transparent. And a lot of PAs didn't know how decisions were made and all that. And I think there's a lot of progress been made in that regard over the last several years.
Yeah, that's wonderful. One question I have for you.
Sure.
How is it that PAs in general are involved with NCCPA? Can you maybe share a little bit about that?
Sure. And you know, let's start with the leadership of the organization. Like SDPA, a not-for-profit organization, NCCPA is governed really by a volunteer board of directors. There are 18 members of the board, 11 of whom are PAs. And that, without boring everyone with the history, that's a big change, because if you go back not so far in the past, the NCCPA board was much larger and was frankly physician dominated. But at this point, 11 of the 18 are PAs, including Dawn is the CEO. She's a non-voting member of the board. And then there are 5 physicians and 2 public members of our board. So that group of 11 PAs, 10 plus Dawn, are very important in the leadership of the organization. But what's also important, and is again a change, is that literally hundreds of PAs are involved in a lot of other activities of NCCPA, from writing questions that appear on the exams that PAs love so much, and many other ways, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But literally, over the last few years, hundreds of PAs have been involved in a variety of these activities, and that's a change, and that's an important part of also of pulling back the curtain, because you know there's about 150,000 certified PAs in the country now, so when you say a couple hundred PAs, that may not sound like a lot, but it's a significant number, and we're very careful when selecting PAs, particularly PAs that serve on the committees that write the questions that appear on the exams, to ensure that there's diversity. And when I use the term diversity, I mean in every sense of the word: years in practice, specialty of practice, geography, age, race, ethnicity, certainly things like that. But
sure.
But that's we take that very seriously when identifying PAs to be involved in the processes.
And do you find that more and more PAs are volunteering for these positions, or being asked to join?
Well, let's say we don't have a hard time finding people to fill the roles. I don't know that there are thousands of PAs that are volunteering, but we certainly go through a vetting process, and you know there are a lot of PAs that you know throw their name in the hat, so to speak. I will say, and this isn't a scientific study by any means, but far and away the majority of PAs who come into the NCCPA offices and participate in a variety of activities come away with a new appreciation for the organization. And of course, during the pandemic times, there weren't so many in-person meetings. In fact, there were virtually none last year. We're just beginning to move back into that a little bit, and hopefully by next year we'll be in full force in that regard. But I think when PAs see how the organization works, literally being involved, they come away with a really positive feeling. So I think it's a positive experience for PAs, and we certainly encourage PAs to express their interest if they're so inclined.
How would somebody go about expressing their interest? Should they reach out to NCCPA directly, or?
Thank you for asking that question. I'll tell you, there was a slide in my presentation, but it's a very easy email to remember, so I'll just say it. It's volunteer@nccpa.net. So if a PA sends an email address or an email to that address, someone will get back to them and talk about options and ways to go through the process, et cetera, et cetera.
Wonderful.
So it's very easy. Volunteer@nccpa.net.
Great. So to kind of piggyback on that, I know the pilot alternative for the Panry ended in 2020. What did you guys find in that pilot program?
Yeah, that was, I always say with a little bit of sarcasm, when PAs think of NCCPA, they think of Panry, and frequently not in a very positive way. The controversy swirling around Panry has been there almost from the beginning of the profession. And that process of going through that very elaborate pilot, which was, I'm not going to bore everyone with all the details because a lot of PAs are familiar with it, but basically it was a 2-year process. It started in the beginning of 19 and went through 2020. So the way that worked is over the course of those 2 years, PAs answered 200 questions, 25 questions per quarter, compared to the traditional Panry, which is done at testing centers, is 240 questions. But it was the same content area being assessed, but in 2 very different ways. And if you don't mind, I'd like to describe some of those details because, nothing is ever 100% universal, but I can say the feedback from the PAs who participated in the pilot was extraordinarily positive. Very, very positive. So it's worth talking more about. And so traditional Panry, 240 questions, 4 hours, you basically either pass or fail. Not a lot of feedback given on areas that you didn't answer correctly. And everyone's familiar with that type of high stakes, very secure exam. The pilot was done, as I mentioned, 25 questions each quarter, but PAs who participated could access those from their iPhone, from a smartphone, or from a pad or a laptop or anything, so long as you had internet access. So you could do it from your office or your den or the beach or anywhere. You had to answer the questions during that quarter period. You didn't have to answer all 25 at one time. So there was a lot of flexibility built into there. And because you were doing this at wherever, you had the ability to use resources, which is clearly not the case with the traditional Panry done under very high secure circumstances. Each question had some amount of time allocated to it. So, and because it was a pilot, we were sort of experimenting with how much time to allow. I won't get into all the details there, but suffice it to say, PAs had at least 3 minutes to answer a question, which is not a lot of time, but it's certainly some time, and it gave PAs the ability to use a resource if they chose. What we got, the feedback that we heard from PAs is not all PAs used resources, and certainly not on every question, but if they have the ability, they had a couple minutes, they would check to make sure that the answer that they provided was correct. I mean, why not? Why not verify it if you have the ability to do that? And I think it's worth adding, because this is very different than the way Panry has been done in the past, that it's partially a reflection on how medicine is practiced these days, because everything is so immediately available via your phone or iPad or whatever instrument you use, and our feeling is, why not allow that to be part of this assessment of knowledge? So that in and of itself was a very big difference. Then another big difference is you got instant feedback on whether you got it right or the question right or wrong, and why the right answer was right and the wrong answers were wrong. and there was a list of reference for every question. So there's, as you can imagine, a significant educational component built in. It's an assessment of knowledge, it's still an exam, but it's a very robust and different form of that. And then lastly, and this is a really, I think a really neat thing about this, that as PAs answered these questions, for each question they also answered two sort of unrelated things. One was, this is before you found out if you got the question right or wrong, I might add. One question was, how much does this topic relate to what you do clinically? And secondly, on a Likert scale, you know, sort of 1 to 5, you know, not at all or a lot. And the other part was, how confident are you in your answer?
Oh, wow.
Before you knew whether you got it right or wrong. So the way this system, the IT behind this system, let's say, for example, you answered a question on whatever, on hypertension. You say, this is very relevant to what I do clinically, and I'm very confident in my answer, and you get it wrong. Well, the system flags that as like, that's kind of something that we should reassess. Right. And somewhere later in the process, you would be asked another question on that topic. And if you get it right the second time, your wrong answer doesn't count against you.
Oh, wow. That's
so it's sort of I call it a living, breathing assessment of knowledge, which is a really cool aspect of this. And after the first quarter, up to 5 of those so-called targeted questions could be included in each quarter. So that was a really neat part of this. Yeah. And then, and real quickly also, before I forget, I should say, when all was said and done, over 18,000 PAs completed the pilot. Wow. So it was a huge number, huge. And we gathered a huge amount of data because of that. That's all the very good news. The pilot ended at the end of last year. We've been massaging and tweaking all of that data and looking at it. Just real quickly, if PAs remember, we shifted a few years ago from an overall 6-year cycle to a 10-year cycle. And by doing that, we in essence created a donut hole of 3 years where almost no one is taking Panry. And we're in that right now. Okay. So the goal was to complete the pilot, to have a couple of years of time to look at that data, to look at how PAs performed on that, prior to the next big bolus of PAs who have to take Panry is 2024, and historically we allow PAs to do that a year early, so we're thinking 2023 is the time when we have to have an alternative, if you will, a real alternative to Panry ready to roll out. And our board has in fact approved a model for a longitudinal assessment, which is very similar to what I just described. There's actually some more bells and whistles added in. We're going to start talking about that in a lot more detail early next year, early 2022, and PAs will then have the opportunity to begin to sign up in 23 for that alternative. So okay. I think that's really, really positive news for a lot of PAs who have for years or maybe even decades really had a lot of angst about the traditional format of Panry, particularly PAs in specialties like yours, right, who don't deal with all of the sort of the core medical topics that are included in the content on Panry.
Exactly. So myself, for example, I've taken Panry, I think it's 3 times now, and because I'm in a specialty that's so like specialized, I have to go back every time I am due for my Panry exam and take a CME course that kind of just does a in-depth review of, you know, everything else that's on the test. And so that's going to be really, really helpful. So thank you for.
Yeah, let me just add one thing because I think it's worth mentioning. You know, the controversy about Panry is not, we're not oblivious to that at NCCPA. And you know, I think it's worth just reiterating that our certification maintenance process basically has 2 components. One is the CME requirement, which for the most part is not very controversial. I mean, not too many PAs complain about that. And the second is some assessment of knowledge. And you know, historically, and it continues to be the case, that assessment of knowledge is of core medical knowledge. And the rationale for that is because the credential, the PAC credential, is a generalist credential.
Right.
And most PAs, I'm told by some of your derm colleagues that no PA would ever leave dermatology, but most PAs, and by most I mean 75+% of PAs change specialties over the courses of their careers. And we believe, I think the profession supports that flexibility, and in NCCPA, we believe that the generalist nature of the credential allows for that. If you were certified in dermatology, you may not be able to move to emergency medicine, whatever. You get the point.
Sure.
But the price to pay for that generalist certification is an assessment of generalist knowledge, if you will. So that controversy is certainly, we're aware of that controversy. We believe that this way of assessing that core medical knowledge is a little bit more palatable, and in some ways even better because of the ability to remediate and to learn as you're just, and as you're being assessed at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think my experience throughout my career has always led back to that core knowledge. My director of my program, he always would tell us, you guys that want to specialize, more power to you. Y'all go and do what you want to do and find your passion and follow that, but don't ever forget that core knowledge, and,
Right.
and always have that as your foundation, basically. So that always stuck with me, and I actually started out in family medicine and did family medicine for about 4 years
There you go.
before I transitioned
Right.
into dermatology.
Right.
So I think I fall into that 75%.
You may never go out of dermatology, but right. Yeah, and that is kind of the foundation of the PA profession. Is our education is generalist in nature. Of course, we have to have the standards for accreditation for PA programs and require that you have some exposure to surgery and pediatrics and OB-GYN and all these various things. But because of that, we're basically educated as generalists, and we're certified that way. I believe that's been. Some use the term, it's a hallmark of the PA profession. And we know for a fact it makes the profession very popular among people who are considering entering healthcare. Because it makes us different than, we're so frequently compared to nurse practitioners, and their educational and certification model is different in that regard. So enough of that.
Yeah. I'd like to ask you a little bit about the CAQ exam. That has been around for a while, and these exams have had different focuses in different areas of specialty, but I understand that the NCCPA is now working on a dermatology CAQ exam. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Absolutely, and we are. And let me just say before I even get into it, we're particularly appreciative and enthusiastic about the support of SDPA. The CAQ program has actually been around for 10 years. It's actually into its 11th year, and it's not been without controversy. There was a lot of concern early on that it was sort of going to undo what I just talked about.
Right.
That if PAs now had a credential in emergency medicine, they were going to be stuck into that specialty. And the fact that, I'm not going to get into all the details of the CAQ because certainly all the details are available on our website and other places. But it's a voluntary credential over and above the PAC. It's not like your PAC parens, emergency medicine, whatever. It doesn't affect your generalist credential. It's an extra recognition of experience and knowledge in a specialty area. So in any case, some of that controversy has gone away because, to be very candid, the uptake of the CAQ has not been particularly impressive, shall we say. After 10 plus years, there are about, about 150,000 PAs, just over 2,100 have a CAQ. So it's not a particularly strong uptake. I will say NCCPA remains committed to the program. One of the questions that's frequently asked is, given that low uptake, are we just going to pull the plug on it? And our board has recommitted to the program, has asked us to find ways to make it more flexible, which we've introduced some of those things. And as you mentioned, we're actually, the board has approved development of 2 additional CAQs, one in dermatology, and one in palliative medicine and hospice care, which I won't get into. The process of developing a new CAQ will take a couple of years. There's multiple steps and as you know, because you're participating with us, we have what we call a specialty advisory group of PAs who help us to determine what are the requirements to be eligible for a CAQ. Some of that work has been done. Then there's some additional steps of doing a practice analysis of PAs in dermatology, which will lead to a content blueprint for the exam, because as you mentioned, these CAQs do have an exam component to them. And by the way, these are not questions like derm-related questions that we pull off one of our other exams. These exams will be developed all from the beginning with a group of PAs, probably one or two physician dermatologists to help us develop the content for the exam. And that's going to take a little while. So PAs who may have an interest in this will be talking about the ability to register for the CAQ as early as next year, but the exam probably won't be ready until the following year, so no one's going to be able to get their CAQ in dermatology probably for a couple more years at this point. But you know, watch for our information in that regard.
Updates, yeah.
Yep. So that, in a nutshell, that's kind of how they're developed. You know, as I said, the controversy has sort of died down a little bit, but one of the areas that we considered very carefully before starting this process was the support of the organization that represents that specialty. Mm-hmm. And that's why I said at the outset, SDPA was very supportive, and that was a very important, influential factor in us. Because, you know, to be honest, it's a significant financial commitment to go through the development of a new CAQ, particularly to the development of an exam, because it involves a lot of work and bringing in a lot of people, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Yeah, and the SDPA has its own, so to speak, exam or added qualification with the Diplomat Fellowship program. When in working with SCPA, how did that kind of play a role with the creation of the CAQ
Well,
test?
we list that as a very strongly recommended component of this, for a PA to have that credential before they seek the CAQ credential. I'll be, in the interest of pulling back the curtain, I'll say there was some even discussion of making it a requirement, but let's just say there were some legal concerns about, you know, the two organizations having their own credential and that we can't link those two as a requirement. Maybe that's not the best way to describe that, but suffice it to say, it will definitely be seen as a very important credential if a PA is considering getting a CAQ, because it's such a great comprehensive overview of the specialty of dermatology. Yeah. Because there is one of the components of the CAQ is that PAs who are interested in it must document that they've had CME specifically related to their specialty, which generally speaking isn't much of a hurdle for PAs, because a lot, but the Diplomat Fellowship sort of covers that without any question, and that we see that as a really nice feature, and something that SDPA should rightfully be very proud of.
And I think they are. You know, in all honesty, as a Diplomat Fellow myself, it's a quite challenging qualification to attain. So, I think NCCPA has a lot of really great things lined up for PAs, especially derm PAs, for the future. I really want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. You know, as a PA myself, I feel like sometimes we don't really give the NCCPA maybe as much credit as it's due for all its hard work. And I really appreciate you kind of sharing some of the things that go on behind the scenes that a lot of us probably aren't even really aware of. So well, thank you so much.
So that was a pleasure, and this was a lot of fun. So thanks very much, Gilbert.
Yes, sir. Appreciate you.
Yep.
With Dermcast TV, my name's Gilberto Saenz. Thank you so much.